So, chapters 4 and 5 really talk about meaningful and purposeful assessments. But before we get started on that, I want to do a quick review to kind of talk about chapters 1 through 4 and really make sure that you understand how it all falls together. So, we began the conversation last week by talking about backwards mapping and planning. So, really, how we design down from the standards and we deliver instruction up so students achieve those standards. So, essentially, we have the major unit focus up here, and then our culminating product and rubric, essential knowledge, skills, and questions, learning activities, and then our critical resources. Okay. So there's 5-step standards-based unit planning process. The first step is major unit focus. So this is where you're figuring out what the major focus is. You have a central organizer. They're based on national standards and your unit goals, and you have your essential questions. The second thing is the second one is culminating assessment and evaluation rubric, followed by essential knowledge, skills, and abilities. Learning activities and performance-based formative assessments is the fourth thing, and then your critical resources is the fifth step. So if we look at our major unit of focus, what should the students know and be able to do? You essentially want to have a theme, a concept, a content, skill, an issue, a problem, etc. You're going to captivate and motivate learning among the students. And you want to make sure that it's initially identified. You don't want to say, okay, we're doing basketball and not have these things laid out. You want to make sure that you're targeting your standards and goals. So these are the Shape America National Standards or the Michigan Standards that are posted online. They're essentially the same thing, but I gave you the link to the Michigan Standards last week. The grade level content expectations, you need to make sure that you're covering those, sorry. And then if your local school district has school goals, you want to make sure that those are reflected in your targeted standards and goals. You want to make sure that you're addressing individual student needs, abilities, and interests. And so you want to make sure that you have enough leeway in your lessons, that you're allowing for modifications and adaptations within your lesson plans once you get there. And you really want to make sure that you know what students should be able to do. So you're going to address this in the central organizer and achieve the targeted standards. Next, you want to make sure that you have your essential questions. So we talked about these in the lecture earlier. For this section, 5 to 7 questions per unit is recommended. They need to be relevant to the student. Your student should be able to think, analyze, and gain understanding or apply knowledge by hearing the essential question. They really help narrow the focus of the learning for the student. You want to make sure that you identify questions that students should be able to answer throughout or by the end of the unit. So don't make it so off the wall that students aren't able to figure out, what's going on or how it's relevant. So the culminating assessment. Today we're going to talk about the different types of assessment. The culminating assessment is a summative assessment if you read chapter 5. And so this assessment, you're developed only after the elements of the major focus are complete. You want to design it to determine if students have achieved standards and unit goals. So this should be a summative assessment. Again, summarizing what they have learned. It's usually completed at the end of the unit. It takes the form of a performance or a product that is engaging to students. It should really be a rich demonstration and application of knowledge and skills that a student has learned, and authentic or realistic to the content and to the student. And so when you think about a summative assessment, sometimes instructors do a combination of a knowledge test and performance skill, where they're able to perform in a game situation, and then they do some type of a knowledge test accompanying it. But other times, the summative assessment is really just making sure within the gameplay that they are aware of the knowledge and skills that they need to be aware of. It could be a project that students work on for weeks, or a performance that might be completed in 1 or 2 classes. Both the students and the teacher should see what the students have achieved and learned. And there must include an evaluation or scoring rubric that is shared with the students before completing the culminating assessment. So you should not be going into a tournament and say, oh, this is your culminating assessment. You need to perform in the tournament, and then not give them a rubric of what they're getting assessed on, etc. It needs to be all very upfront and apparent to the students. The third thing is essential knowledge, skills, and abilities. And so you really want to be able to identify the knowledge, skills, and abilities that students need in order to complete the culminating assessment. The steps that students must climb to reach the targeted standards and goals. And you really need to ask yourself, what do students need to know and be able to do to complete the culminating assessment? So this is what's going to make up your essential knowledge skills. Integrated learning and formative assessment activities. So this is really the meat and the heart of your instructional unit. This should be created after essential knowledge, skills, and abilities are identified. You really want to make sure that you're stair-stepping the students to achieve the goals and standards. So you're not starting out by the most complicated, you're starting out with the very basic, and you're stair-stepping them up through your lessons that you're creating to get them to the final thing that you want them to do. This is obviously known as progression, and you need to make sure that you're implementing progression throughout your lesson planning and throughout your unit. Within progression, you want to make sure that there's practice, improve, and extend the task, and then that students are able to apply skills and content knowledge. You want to also make sure that it involves informing, extending, refining, and application of tasks. So when you think about an initial task that you have planned for a student, and then you want to make sure that you have extensions in there for students that might need extensions to a certain task because maybe they're at a higher level than their classmates. And then once they have either completed the initial task or extended it, then you want to be able to help them refine their task. So how do they get better at it? And then again, applying the task to a game-like or a real-life situation. So continuing on, integrated learning and formative assessment activities. So these are the formative or progressive assessments are developed and integrated with instructional and learning activities. So these take out throughout the unit. These take place throughout the unit. It's essential for teachers to provide continuous feedback to students on how they're progressing throughout the unit. So you don't want them to just find out at the end that they're failing. You really want to be giving them feedback throughout the unit. And you want to make sure that you're providing continuous assessment for them. So tracking students' progress toward readiness to complete the culminating assessment and how they're achieving the goals and standards. And then you essentially need to be communicating this back to them. So a lot of this is shown within a block plan. So as we talked previously, the block plan is a map or a schedule of instructional learning and formative assessment. You have a day-by-day sequence. Your lesson plans are then really developed from your block plan. And you want to make sure that your unit extends over a sufficient period of time, but not too long. So if you remember last week, I talked about how, I was visiting a district and they had a 16-week basketball unit. That's probably a little bit long for a unit, especially if you're seeing kids every day. So you want to make sure that the unit is long enough that you're able to get everything in that you need to get in. But again, that it's not too long, that kids are getting bored and they're not meeting learning tasks. Okay, 5 is the critical resources. So these are the resources needed for planned activities, instruction, educational experiences, and assessments. But it also includes your facilities, making sure that you have sufficient amount of equipment. Maybe you're going to have guest instructors. Um, what materials do you need to actually support your instruction while you're teaching the kids? And then also it includes the references and resources that helped you in the planning process. And I think, again, it's really important to point out that you should be using resources to plan out this process. There is no reason why you're going to take off the top of your head, okay, this is what should happen in a basketball unit. You need to be using your resources, whether that's PE Central, whether that's textbooks that you've had, the library, from credible sources of what should be included in those specific units that you're trying to tackle. All right, so again, just to review, you have your major unit focus, which includes the central organizer, the national standards, units, and goals. And by national standards, that's the national or state standards. And then your essential questions. You have your culminating assessment and evaluation rubric. You have your essential knowledge, skills, and abilities. You have your learning activities and performance-based formative assessments. And you have your critical resources. Once you have your unit and block plan complete, then you start your lesson plan development and you figure out how you are going to progress your students throughout the lessons each day to essentially move them to the unit goals and standards that you want to meet. So your lesson plans are really a vehicle in which the unit plan is implemented and how you're moving the students along to progress them towards the final goal that you are looking for that unit. Now we're going to talk about designing different types of assessment. So in the chapters that you read, it talked about the different types of assessment, and I'm just going to briefly touch on them tonight. The first one is summative assessment. So remember when we talked about assessment of learning and assessment for learning? Well, the summative assessment is the assessment of learning. It's really the purpose of it is to determine a fair grade for the learner. You want to inform the students at the beginning of the unit about what their summative assessment will be so that they can work towards that throughout the unit. The summative assessment should always be teacher directed, and it should be framed around a culminating project or activity. So the culminating project or activity, it should take several days to complete and have several tasks that allow students to demonstrate learning in all 3 domains. So when you think about those 3 domains, you're talking about the psychomotor, the affective, and the cognitive domains. So you want to be assessing in all 3 of those domains. And you want them to be able to, take part in these 3 different things over a period of a couple of days. Because what if someone's having a bad day, or you want to make sure that you're accounting for some of those variables that could happen. The next type of assessment that we're going to talk about is formative assessment. So this assessment is really intended for learning and not really for a grade. So informative assessments, they're informative because they're intended for learning. They're not for a grade. They really should help students review skills or concepts that were previously taught, but they also indicate progress toward the final learning goals. So they help students and the teacher understand where the students are at before they get to the summative assessment. There's different types of formative assessment. There's self-assessments where students can self-record and track their progress or set their own goals. There's also peer assessments where teachers design the task, explain, and then demonstrate. So, for example, if you have a pair of students, one student is a performer, one student is an observer, assessor, or coach. And so one student's performing, one student is either observing, one is assessing, one's coaching. You could have one performing, one videotaping, one giving directions. So essentially, it's however you want it to be done, but it can be done with peer assessments. It is key that it's written down and new goals are set once the assessment takes place. So another type of assessment is teacher directed. So this is where the teacher makes a written record of the observations and then the assessment has occurred. It only occurs though if the teacher makes instructional decisions and or the results are communicated to the students. So it's not just the teacher taking down the information, it's the teacher taking down the information, writing it down, and then communicating that back to the student. This type of teacher-directed assessment should really be used for planning future instruction. Using formative assessment should really be to help improve student learning. So you need to make sure that you identify students that are struggling, or by assessing, you're going to be able to identify the students that are struggling. Also, students, if you use formative assessment that's not for a grade, students will be less tempted to cheat to improve scores if they realize assessments are for instructional and learning purposes. So just kind of a side note on that. Another type of assessment is called diagnostic testing. So this is really to determine what you need to know about the student's skills, knowledge, and attitude before the unit begins. But know that it doesn't always have to be psychomotor, especially if students haven't had contact before. So it could come from the affective or cognitive domains. If you're performing psychomotor, then you need to make sure that safety is not an issue. So you're not just having them play a game without knowing or having any understanding of it, because that could cause safety issues. But you're setting them up so that safety is not an issue. The purpose of diagnostic testing is really to identify a baseline in which the students are, and allows you to plan your lessons accordingly depending on that baseline. It can also help identify skill level to form appropriate teams. So different diagnostic tests for the different domains. So for psychomotor domain, you could have skill tests, you could have rating scales, self-rating, observation rating using a rubric. For the affective domain, it could be a written test on etiquette or a questionnaire. In the cognitive domain, it's usually like a written test on strokes, rules, scoring, and tactics. I would highly suggest using this in middle school and high school, especially because these are the areas where, we see things taught in elementary school or middle school, and then when kids get to high school, they've already had 8 years of basketball or whatever. So do a pre-assessment, see where your kids are, and then you're able to kind of go from there and plan your lessons accordingly. A couple of things about assessments. Your assessments really need to be meaningful. So they need to be aligned and predetermined learning outcomes, goals, and standards. They need to be purposeful. So you're teaching and improving learning. They should be giving vital information that will help you teach better and will help your students improve their skills. And then, your assessments should be selected purposefully to align with the instructional process. So you shouldn't be choosing assessments just to appease your principal because you yourself are getting assessed that day. You need to make sure that you're selecting the right assessments for the right things that you're trying to assess. One of the things that I hear teachers say often is this idea that they don't have time for assessments. So it's important that you make time for assessments. If your only goal is to improve teaching or inform your instruction, then use sampling. You don't have to assess everyone in the group. You could choose a few representatives or students within the group, and then make sure that you choose new students the next day when you're assessing on something else. It's also important that you remember that the assessments that you do are benefiting you and your students. So it's not just about your students, it's also benefiting your teaching and allowing you to provide the best lesson for your students. One of the things that I think we often forget about is this idea of reflection on assessment. So reflection is one of the key, most important things about a lesson and about assessment, is that you reflect on it. So no matter how long you've been teaching, you should be reflecting. And reflection should be based on assessment data collected. Now, the other thing that you need to remember is that this reflection should be written down, because a lot of times what happens is we teach a lesson and then we don't write our reflections down about it. Even if it's at the end of the day for a reflection, we don't write it down. And then when we go to teach that lesson again, which could be in, a week, or it could be in a year, you don't remember what happened. So you want to make sure that you're reflecting and that you're revisiting those reflections. A couple of things that you could ask yourself to reflect on the end of each lesson is, did my students achieve the student learning outcomes established for the lesson? And what data do I have to back up the conclusion reached about whether learning outcomes were met? The other thing that you need to remember is that you need to have credible and fair assessments. So assessment results should be consistent with the level of student ability. I would highly suggest asking a colleague to review an assessment for you before you give it to your students, so that they can ask questions. They can kind of be that first line where they can screen it for you to make sure everything makes sense, spelled correctly, the questions come across okay, etc. Stability of results. So you want to give students more than one time to succeed, and take an average. So if you think about, especially for skill tests, you want to give them like five tries, and you can score all five and then take an average of them. So it's not just one time and they're done. You want to make sure that it's objective, so the teacher doesn't have any influence over the results. It should not be subjective, which means that it's up to your feelings about it. It needs to be objective. One way to do this is two different teachers could use the same assessment tool and have the same results. Obviously, you're not going to have a separate teacher that's going to be able to assess your students with you, but the idea of this is making sure that the tool that you're using can be replicated with the student, so that if I picked it up and you picked it up, we would essentially have the same results. Assessment should result in accurate assessment of student learning. So what was taught is what is on the test. I hear parents complain or students complain all the time, well, you didn't teach us that, and you had that on the test. You need to make sure that what is on the test is what was taught. Students have had ample opportunity to learn and practice the materials. So you can't just throw, 200 slides at students and say, okay, by tomorrow, I want you to know this and we're going to have a test on it. That's just not realistic. The same goes with psychomotor skills. You need to let them know what they're going to be tested on and give them time to practice it so that they can get better and improve on it before they actually have to be assessed. Your results should not be dependent on other students. So when we think about assessments and gameplay, this is where it gets really tricky, because if I don't have the opportunity to shoot the ball because no one passed me the ball in basketball, I shouldn't be graded down on that. So you always want to make sure that you're assessing in a situation where that student's results are not dependent on other students' actions. And then the last thing is making sure that you have equitable assessments. So developmentally appropriate assessments are also very important. The assessment task is one that most students can accomplish with a reasonable level of success after being taught and given sufficient practice. You want to know what your students are able to do, and then be able to modify it if need be to assess the appropriate skill. The language used on the assessment should be the correct reading level, and you want to make sure that you're using culturally relevant terminology. So I showed you how to check the reading level or the grade level reading in Word, so you need to make sure that you're doing that. If you're giving a fourth grade test and it's at a sixth grade reading level, that's not fair. So you need to make sure that the reading level is appropriate. The other thing that we really need to be cognizant of is making sure that our assessments are culturally relevant and using culturally relevant terminology. And this is one critique of the MTTC, is that it's not necessarily culturally relevant. So they might um, give examples of things that kids in urban areas might not have any clue what it is as compared to kids in the suburbs. Um, I can't think of anything off the top of my head, but essentially, sometimes you can use terminology and you can use examples that certain students might not be able to relate to because of their cultural background. And then the last thing, you want to make sure that you give very clear verbal instructions in addition to the written instructions that you have. Okay, so the last activity that I have for you for this lesson was to create a 4-week block plan. Now, I think that we're actually going to start out with this at the beginning of our class next week. But I want you to come somewhat prepared for that so that it doesn't take tons of time at the beginning of class. So I want you to start thinking about that now. So what you're going to be asked to do when we come to class is to create a 4-week block plan with your partner. And it's going to be a bare bones block plan. So this is not how I outlined earlier, where you have all of those very detailed things. That's not what we're doing here. I want you to create a bare bones block plan. And then I want you to choose a summative assessment and 3 formative assessments and 1 diagnostic assessment. And you're going to put them within your block plan. And then you need to be ready to explain to the class with a rationale for each type of assessment that you included in your plan and why you included it. So this is what we're going to start out with on class next Monday. And so I want to make sure that you take some time to think about that so that you're not just thinking about it for the first time when we come into class, because you're only going to have about 20 minutes to put your entire 4-week block plan together with all of these assessments. All right. I hope you have a great night or a great day whenever you're watching this. It's night for me. And sorry I couldn't come to class today.